So today's lesson is on Congress, and specifically I want to talk about the Constitution and just the rules it sets up for what Congress is, what powers it has, how it functions, all that sort of thing. So the legislature, Congress, is the first thing discussed in the Constitution. It's Article 1. And Article 1 begins by saying, all legislative powers herein granted shall be vested in a Congress of the United States, which shall consist of a Senate and House of Representatives. There are two, I think, important ideas embedded here. One, since all legislative powers are vested in a Congress of the United States, that means there are no legislative powers outside of Congress. The president doesn't have legislative powers. The judiciary doesn't have legislative powers, at least it's not supposed to. Another important idea, we have a bicameral legislature. That word bicameral means two houses. We have a House and a Senate. And you'll sometimes hear me refer to the houses of Congress, and that just refers to both. Article 1, Section 2 discusses the House of Representatives and what their qualifications are and their selection. So the House of Representatives shall be composed of members chosen every second year by the people of the several states, and the electors in each state shall have the qualifications requisite for electors of the most numerous branch of the state legislature. So every 2 years, all 435 members of the House of Representatives are elected or re-elected. They have 2-year terms. They are up every single election. They don't have one off. The other part of that idea that's important, what are the qualifications for voting? Electors just means the voters. So the voters in Texas for the House of Representatives have the same qualifications as the voters in Texas for the Texas House of Representatives. It has to be the same laws for both. Number 2, no person shall be a representative who shall not have attained to the age of 25 years and been 7 years a citizen of the United States, and who shall not, when elected, be an inhabitant of that state in which he shall be chosen. So only 3 basic requirements, and that's all. You have to be 25 years old, you have to be a citizen, and you have to have been a citizen for at least 7 years, and you have to reside in the state that you're elected from. You have to actually live in Texas in order to represent Texas. Here we go. Now, a big part of this has been cut out, and I'll talk about it briefly. This talks more about the apportionment of representatives. We'll skip the taxes part. So by apportionment of representatives, what it means is how many representatives are allotted to each state. And it says this will be done according to their respective numbers. So Texas, California, Louisiana, etc., all 50 states will be allotted a number of representatives according to how many people live in each state, right? How big or small their population is. So Texas is the second most populous state in the country besides California, so we get a lot of representatives. Wyoming has very few people living there, so they get, I think, 1 representative is all. But it does say you have to have at least 1 representative per state. So no matter how small the state is, it has to have at least 1 person represented in the House of Representatives. Now, how do we determine the respective populations of the different states? It tells us that an actual enumeration shall be made. That means a count. And, where does it say this? And within every subsequent term of 10 years, as in such manner as they shall by law direct. So this is referring to the census. The first census was in 1790, and we have had a new census every 10 years since then. The latest one was in 2020. And the census does a lot of things, but the most basic function of it is to count the number of people so we know how many representatives to give the different states. And we also know how many electors to give them for the Electoral College for president. Another important idea here has been cut out. Notice this part says, which shall be determined by adding to the whole number of free persons, including those bound to service for a term of years, and excluding Indians not taxed 3/5 of all other persons. 3/5 of all other persons referred to slaves. And it meant for purposes of deciding how many representatives a state gets in Congress, a slave will count as 3/5 of a free person. This was a compromise. The slave states wanted to count slaves equal to free persons. The non-slave states didn't want to count slaves at all because they didn't think it was right to give them extra representation in Congress for having slaves. The compromise was the 3/5 clause. Since slavery is now abolished, this line has been struck out. This tells us what to do when vacancies happen, and the easy rule is the executive authority, meaning the governor of the state where the vacancy happens, will issue a writ for a new election and fill the vacancy. The House will choose the Speaker, that is the Speaker of the House, and other officers, and shall have the sole power of impeachment. So two concepts here. The Speaker of the House is mentioned in the Constitution, is the leader of the House of Representatives, and the first thing they do, or one of the first things they do, probably the first thing, every time they have a new Congress, so they'll be meeting in January of 2023, first thing they'll do is elect a Speaker. And if the Democrats retain control of the House, it'll probably be Nancy Pelosi again. If the Republicans win control of the House, they will elect a Speaker from their own party. The House has the sole power of impeachment. Presidents can be impeached, judges can be impeached, other executive officials can be impeached. The one that gets a lot of attention is when presidents are impeached, but they have to originate in the House. The Senate doesn't decide to impeach somebody. They hold a trial afterwards, but they don't decide to impeach somebody. Only the House does. Now, Article 1, Section 3 turns to the Senate and tells us a little bit about the rules and the qualifications. So, the senators have 6-year terms. Every state has 2 senators. And I put here the 17th Amendment because that was an important change in how the senators got elected. Originally, the 2 senators from each state were chosen by the state legislatures. So Texas's legislature chose in Austin which 2 senators to send to Washington. With the 17th Amendment, we now have statewide elections. The legislatures no longer make the choice. What if there's a vacancy in the Senate? Here, the state executive fills the vacancy with a temporary appointment until the next election cycle. So if one of our senators were to resign or pass away, the governor of Texas would pick a temporary replacement until the next election can be had. This article, or this section, also talks about the elections for senators. They're staggered. So the Senate is divided into thirds. You have 33, 33, and 34, as evenly as they can get it. And every 2 years, 1/3 of the senators is up for re-election, 1/3 of the seats. So in Texas, that means we have, let's see, in 2022, there are no Senate elections, right? No one's up for re-election. In 2024, the seat that's occupied by Ted Cruz will be up for re-election. And in 2026, the seat that's occupied by John Cornyn will be up for re-election. And in 2028, again, none of the seats. So it's staggered every 2 years, a different seat or none at all. Here are the basic qualifications for senators. Slightly tougher than what the House qualifications were, but not very tough at all. All you have to be to fulfill the basic requirements is you have to be 30 years old. You have to be a citizen for at least 9 years, and you have to inhabit the state that you are elected from. Now, the vice president is technically the president of the Senate. That is what Clause 4 of the Constitution says. But the vice president only really plays a role in the Senate on 2 occasions. One, ceremonial things like administering oaths. And more importantly, the one really important job that the vice president does is they have a tie-breaking vote. And sometimes that does really matter. So if it's 50-50, or people are absent that day, if it's 48-48, 49-49, the vice president can step in and break the tie. Otherwise, she doesn't get a vote, and she doesn't really play any role other than that. There is an officer called the President pro tempore. Pro tempore is Latin, and it just means temporary. So the President pro tempore is a member of the Senate who acts as president of the Senate when the vice president isn't there, which is most of the time. And again, it's mostly a ceremonial role. They do some administrative stuff. They might preside over the sessions, but they don't have a lot of power that goes along with this role. By tradition, for the last 70 years or more, the President pro tempore has been the senior member of the majority party. So whoever's been there the longest has the most seniority. Clause 6 discusses the trial of impeachment. So remember I said earlier, the House impeaches, the Senate tries. In other words, the way impeachment works is the House decides to impeach. If a majority of the House chooses to impeach a president or someone else, then you have a trial in the Senate. So how many presidents have been impeached in the United States history? Anyone know? How many presidents have been impeached in the United States history? Who was the last president to be impeached in U.S. history? Donald Trump, exactly right. Before him, Bill Clinton. Before them, going way back, a guy named Andrew Johnson. How many presidents have been impeached and convicted? Trick question. 0. So conviction is much harder. What it says here is you have to have a 2/3 vote of the senators who are present. So that doesn't mean 2/3 of the Senate. That would be 67. It means whoever's present in the chamber at the time of the vote, 2/3 of those people have to vote to convict. Okay? Now, because some of them choose to abstain. Some of them choose to not vote. They don't want, for whatever reason. Another important part of this clause, if the president is the person being impeached, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court presides over the trial. In other words, the Chief Justice shows up and treats it like he is the judge of a courtroom, right? Hearing evidence, hearing witnesses, etc., and manages the trial. This is a picture from 1999. Bill Clinton had been impeached by the House. The trial was now ongoing in the Senate. You can see the senators there. And you can't really see him very well, but way over here on the left, sitting in the center of the picture, is the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court presiding over the trial. These are the 3 presidents I mentioned earlier. Andrew Johnson on the left, Bill Clinton in the middle. Donald Trump is the only president to have been impeached twice. So all 3 have been impeached, were impeached, and acquitted. So they were not removed from office. Some people get confused and they think, what about Richard Nixon? Does anyone remember why Richard Nixon isn't on this list? You've all heard of the Watergate scandal, probably. He is not on this list because he resigned instead of being impeached. He was about to be impeached. It was going to happen like a day or two later, and to save himself that embarrassment, he went ahead and just resigned. And he probably would have been convicted and removed. He would have been the first and only one, but he resigned anyway. So the penalty for conviction, if the Senate convicts the president, the only penalties are the president is removed from office, or anyone else that's impeached. The penalties are you are removed from office and you're disqualified from any future federal office. So if Donald Trump had been convicted, the only penalty is he would have been forced to leave the presidency and he would be ineligible to run again or to do any other federal job, like senator or whatever it might be. Now, if you're guilty of some crime that led to your impeachment, you can still be tried and convicted and punished in a regular criminal court, but this isn't a regular criminal court. Its job is just to decide whether or not the president is fit for continuing in the office or has to be removed. Now, moving on to elections. The clause 1 is the only one I want to talk about here. The basic rule is the states decide the time and manner of elections. So it says the times, places, and manner. So it's up to Texas to decide where, when, and how we will have our presidential elections, congressional elections, our state elections, etc. But Congress may at any time, by law, make or alter such regulations. So Congress can come up with its own rules instead, and that would invalidate the state rules, right, if Congress wants to. Section 5 has a whole lot of stuff. Only clauses 1 and 2 are really interesting to me now. So the basic rule is, in number 1, each house judges its own members' elections, returns, and qualifications. So if there's some question, suppose I run for Congress and the election ends with a great deal of controversy and it's not clear whether or not I really won the election or whether or not I really am qualified to be elected to Congress. Who decides the controversy? Who decides whether or not I really won or whether or not I'm really qualified? The House of Representatives will decide. Or if I'm elected to the Senate will decide. So suppose I run for the Senate in this year, 2022, and someone says, hey, wait a minute, he's not really a resident of the state where he won the election, which would be a major controversy. It would be a big deal. Well, the Senate will hear the evidence and vote and decide itself whether or not to admit me. Now, there's another concept here that's important. It says in clause 1, it mentions the idea of a quorum, and a majority of each shall constitute a quorum to do business. A quorum is another Latin type term, and it means the minimum number of people necessary in order to do business. So in the House and Senate, it is a majority. A majority of each shall constitute a quorum. So in the Senate, you need to have 51 senators in order to do anything. Otherwise, you don't have a quorum, you can't pass any bills, you can't have any votes, you can't do any work until you get that majority. If there's a smaller number, suppose there are only 30 people in the Senate one day, and they're like, hey, we need to do some work, they can actually call the other members in and basically order them to come back inside or from wherever they might be wandering around, and so that they can start doing some work.
Another important concept, each house determines its own rules,
punishes members, and expels members with a 2/3 vote. I can't remember if this guy was expelled or not, but well, let me say punishes members. Suppose I am a member of the House or the Senate, and I do something really unethical, really maybe not a crime, but embarrassing. The House or the Senate might vote by a majority to censure me, which means it's like they're saying it's a slap on the wrist. They're saying what you did was wrong, we don't approve of it, and it's here in the record. And they can make up the rules for when that's appropriate and when it's not, etc. But suppose they want to expel me. There was an interesting case of a congressman a few years ago they found that he had something like $100,000 in cash in a freezer in his office in the House of Representatives in the Capitol building. And the cash was almost certainly bribes that he had been collecting and storing in the freezer. I can't remember for sure, but there was talk of expelling him, of just kicking him out, right, of the House of Representatives. And if they did, it would have had to have been a 2/3 vote of the House in order to expel him. I don't remember if they did or not, but that's what it would have taken. Okay, Article 1, Section 6 just says the senators and the representatives receive a salary. It's paid from the Treasury. But there are two very important concepts here. They cannot be arrested during attendance except for treason, felony, breach of the police, or breach of the peace. So if it's an ordinary crime, a misdemeanor, you can't arrest them while they're in this Capitol building, while they're doing their work. The idea is we don't want them harassed for petty crimes like speeding tickets while they're trying to do the work. Also, and this is even more important, the very, very, very last part of this clause says, they shall not be questioned in any other place for speech or debate in Congress. What that means is they should have freedom of speech. They should have the freedom to say whatever they want, whatever their opinion is, and they can't be punished for it in courts outside of Congress. They can't even be questioned. So a court can't call them in and say, hey, tell us what you meant by this speech you gave in Congress. No, they're free from criticism. This clause, no senator or representative shall be appointed to any civil office under the authority of the United States during the time for which he was elected. And no person holding any office under the United States shall be a member of either house during his continuance in office. All that means is, if you're a senator or a representative, you can't also work in a different branch of the government at the same time. It has to be one or the other, which is common sense. This is very important. Clause 1 of Section 7 says all bills for raising revenue shall originate in the House of Representatives. A bill for raising revenue is a tax, and a tax cannot start in the Senate. It must start in the House. This is an important clause called the presentment clause. Bills must be presented to the president for signature to become laws. If the president signs it, it becomes a law. If the president vetoes it or rejects it, it is sent back to the House where it started with a message from the president saying why he vetoed it. Then it's either dead or, in fairly rare circumstances, the House can repass it, override the veto with a 2/3 vote. And it has to be a 2/3 vote in the House and a 2/3 vote in the Senate. And then we say that the veto was overridden and it becomes law anyway. What if a president just ignores a bill? Doesn't sign it, doesn't send it back? After 10 days, it becomes law automatically, unless Congress has adjourned in the meantime, meaning they've gone home. And in that case, it's treated as a de facto veto. This clause basically says the same thing. Resolutions that pass both the House and the Senate must also be presented to the president for a signature. That's all it says. Now, the next three slides, I'm not going to read them line by line because it's tedious, but Article 1, Section 8 lists about 24 enumerated powers of Congress. What that means is enumerated as in numbered or spelled out. So these are the powers that are specifically granted to Congress by the Constitution. We also have what we can call unenumerated, or better yet, just implied powers. So these would be powers that Congress has, but they aren't word for word specifically granted to it here in Section 8. So these are powers like collect taxes, borrow money, regulate commerce, coin money. Here it says Congress can punish piracies and felonies, declare war, raise and support armies, provide and maintain a navy, provide for calling forth the militia, organizing, arming, and disciplining the militia. So those are the specific enumerated powers. But they're not the only powers Congress has. The unenumerated powers are created by this clause, the very last clause of Section 8. It says, Congress shall have the power to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers and all other powers vested by this Constitution. This is called the necessary and proper clause. It's also sometimes called the elastic clause, because like a rubber band, it is elastic. It stretches the powers of Congress. So if you combine the listed powers with this necessary and proper clause, you get all sorts of new powers that are implied. For example, there was a this example goes back to the 1790s. Article 1, Section 8 says Congress can coin money. Congress can regulate commerce. Congress can tax. Those are specific enumerated powers. Well, the first Secretary of the Treasury, Alexander Hamilton, said, I want Congress to create a bank, a corporation. Thomas Jefferson was against the idea, and he said, no. Look at Article 1, Section 8. It says coin money, it says regulate commerce, it says tax. It doesn't say Congress has the power to create corporations. It doesn't say Congress has the power to create banks. Therefore, according to Jefferson, you can't do it. It's not there. Congress doesn't have the authority. Hamilton said, but a bank is necessary and proper for taxing, for coining money, for regulating commerce. And therefore, Hamilton argued it was implied that Congress had the power. Hamilton won the argument. The bank was created, Washington signed it, the bill, the Supreme Court approved of it, and it was decided that that was an implied power of Congress. Section 9 tells us a few things that Congress specifically cannot do. And I just want to focus on the first two lines. The privilege of the writ of habeas corpus shall not be suspended unless, when in cases of rebellion or invasion, the public safety may require it. So it's a limitation. First of all, make sure we remember what the writ of habeas corpus is. The writ of habeas corpus was an ancient English doctrine going back hundreds and hundreds of years that we inherited from England. And it was a protection from unjust or arbitrary imprisonment. So if you were in jail, if the king threw you in jail, someone could file a writ of habeas corpus on your behalf with a judge, and the judge would say to the king or to whoever it was, the jailer, show me the person that you have in jail and tell me why he or she is there. What did they do? And this gives them a chance to defend themselves in court, a chance to know what they're accused of and a chance to defend themselves against the accusation. So Congress can suspend this, meaning that the federal government can put people in jail without accusing them of a crime or giving them a trial, but only in very specific circumstances when there's a rebellion or an invasion. And basically that means the jails don't work. The court system doesn't work. It's an emergency, so that's why Congress can suspend the privilege. Now the next two, you may have never heard of before because they don't happen in the United States because of this prohibition in the Constitution. A bill of attainder was a kind of law that declared someone guilty of a crime and punished him or her. Not a court, not a trial, but in the old days, Parliament might pass a law saying such and such person is guilty of treason and is punishable by forfeiting all of his property to the state. And it's not a court, so there's no trial, there was no defense. It was just Parliament passing a law declaring someone guilty. So Congress can't do things like that here. That's impossible. Congress doesn't have that authority. Next, an ex post facto law shall not be passed. This is a law that is passed and declares something a crime and declares and punishes people who committed that crime before it was a crime. Right? So I might say, here in Texas, we might say, you know what, let's pass a law saying, or Congress would do it because we're the federal government. Congress might pass a law saying, we're going to make it a crime to give more than $1,000 to any political campaign. That would be perfectly normal. If Congress wanted to do that, it might have freedom of speech issues or whatever, but it wouldn't be an ex post facto law. But what if Congress passed a law saying anyone who has ever given over $1,000 to a political campaign is guilty of a misdemeanor and has to pay a fine and go to jail? Now it's an ex post facto law because it's saying they're guilty, but it wasn't a crime when they did it, right? It only is now going forward. So those kinds of things are unconstitutional. The rest of it we won't worry about. It's other stuff. That's important. All right, another important concept, no money shall be drawn from the treasury, but in consequence of appropriations made by law. It may sound very simple, but I think it's very profound. All of the money that's spent by the federal government has to be appropriated by law. Anytime the treasury spends something, they ought to be able to point to a law and say, this is where we got the justification for spending that money. So it can't be arbitrary. The other paragraph here, no title of nobility shall be granted by the United States. So we can't have kings or queens here. No person holding any office of profit or trust under them shall, without the consent of the Congress, except of any present, emolument, office, or title of any kind, whatever, from any king, prince, or foreign state. What that means is simply, if you are holding a federal job, an office of the United States, unless Congress has specifically given you permission, you can't accept a present from a foreign country, or a title from a foreign country, or an emolument, which means compensation, money from a foreign country. Last, I just wanted to throw up this general overview of the House and the Senate and the differences between them. Some of this is I've already mentioned. So the House is bigger, 435 members. The Senate is smaller, 100 members. The House is constantly up for re-election every 2 years. The Senate, they have 6-year terms. That's even longer than presidents. So once they're elected, they don't have to worry about re-election for a little while. In the House, people have narrower constituencies, meaning smaller geographic areas sometimes, and fewer people that they represent. Senators typically represent more people in broader geographic areas. The House is generally less prestigious and the Senate more prestigious. The House originates all revenue bills, meaning tax bills. I didn't mention this yet, but the Senate, on the other hand, ratifies treaties and confirms presidential nominees. Right? If the president nominates somebody for the Supreme Court. The House has nothing to do with it, but the Senate has to confirm that nominee. I'll get into this more later, but in the House of Representatives, committee chairs are very powerful. Because there are 435 people there, if you're just one of 435, you really don't have much power. But if you get to be the head of a committee, the chair of a committee, then you have a lot more power. And the Senate, because there are only 100 of them, basically they're all important and they're all powerful, even if they aren't chairs of specific committees. That's it for today. I'll see you all next time.